this is a sort of an attempt to grapple with where we were in January, and then where we may be now. What kinds of things seem to be important as we thought about the technology industry in January, and what sort of things might be important now as we all sort of sit in the foxholes and try and work out what it's like being in a foxhole, how we can do business, and what the implications of that might be at whatever point we can kind of finally climb out and pull bits of twig out of our hair and brush the mud off ourselves and try and get on with our lives. And so I thought a good way of phrasing that was that we are at the moment in a period of shock and survival, and we work out what we do in lockdown. We then go into a period of phased exit, how we get out of this, and we still, I think, try to work out what that would even mean. And then at some point in the future, we'll be able to walk down the street without wearing a mask and without worrying about whether we have a cough at months, weeks, years into the future. And then we will be in a world that will have changed in some pretty significant ways. And I think we're still trying to work out what all of those mean. Now, I think first it's just worth expressing the character of the shock that we face ourselves in. 40 million Americans filed for unemployment in the last 90 days. This is not the economic and social and cultural shock that we're going through now isn't something that really has any precedent, both in its reach and its scale. And so today we are in a moment of preservation, survival, trying to work out how we can survive, how we can get things done in this situation, what will work, what won't work. And then over the next 6, 12, 24 months, we have some sort of a phased exit. It's not next month, it's not next week, but at a certain sort of graduated phasing, we move through periods of testing, quarantine, vaccine, and we're still working out what that looks like. At the point that we emerge from that, we will be in something that we might call a new normal, now a very overused phrase, and there will be some things that change. So there will be a recession of some kind, and I don't think anyone quite knows what that's going to look like. There will be geopolitical change in the role of the USA, the role of China, an election in the USA at the end of this year. And then there will be political and fiscal and social changes that come out of that. I'm not going to talk about any of those, but what I can talk about a little bit is what the implications of that might be for technology and for the role of technology. And so I think I'd start by saying, well, where was technology in January? And I gave a big presentation at a big event in Davos, which I called Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. And the way that I phrased this was that we've connected everybody on Earth. There's about a bit over 5 billion adults on Earth. 5 billion people have a mobile phone, and over 4 billion people have a smartphone. So we haven't connected literally everybody, but we're well on the way there. Now, meanwhile, e-commerce globally has gone from being something that was interesting to something that's sort of existential. Over 20% in China, which is unsurprising, but also in the UK and South Korea. The US is close to 15%, and a bunch of other developed markets, again, are pushing up towards 10% penetration. So e-commerce has moved from being something that was relatively interesting and exciting, but kind of peripheral to most people, to something that's becoming increasingly central to people's lives and to people's businesses. There's also a little company called Amazon that some people may have heard of, which is now doing over $250 billion in revenue a year, and yet still growing at 20%. But what's interesting about the growth of e-commerce is that it's not just about Amazon anymore. Amazon has about a third of the US e-commerce space, and incidentally, about 6% of US retail, which is a pretty funny definition of a monopoly. But what's more interesting are all the other giant platform companies that are forming around the emergence of e-commerce. So Shopify's market cap is now $85 billion. Stripe had a valuation last year of $35 billion. Instagram and YouTube have turned into commerce platforms. In fact, Shopify did $60 billion of GMV last year. Consumers spent $60 billion with merchants whose platforms were powered by Shopify. Some of the same kind of change is happening in TV, but in some ways it's actually happening quicker. So in the last 5 years, close to 20% of Americans canceled their cable TV subscriptions after kind of a decade of people asking when this would happen. It suddenly happened very, very quickly, and it, as you can see on this chart, happened much more quickly than the growth of e-commerce in the USA. That's also come with an explosion of competition in content. I'm old enough to remember when people laughed at Netflix. Netflix spent $15 billion on acquiring content last year. Looking purely at entertainment, it had the biggest acquisition budget of all the US media companies. And if you take Netflix, Amazon, and Apple combined, that got you to about a third of all the budget being spent across major entertainment companies in the USA last year. That's a US number. I think what's actually much more dramatic is if you look at what's happening outside the USA. So in the UK, Netflix is now by far the biggest TV channel for 18 to 34s, roughly double the video minutes per day of the BBC. And if you count YouTube as a TV channel, which you could do, then that's even bigger again. All of that, of course, flows through to advertising, which a lot of people in the tech industry think about because it pays their bills. And so I thought it was kind of interesting to look at ad spending in the US as a share of GDP back to the war. And what you see here is a sort of a steady, gradual flow of TV as a share of spending. But then in the years after 2000, and in particular the years after the financial crisis, an absolute collapse in newspapers and a commensurate growth in internet advertising spending. But what's also interesting here is that the total share of advertising of GDP has gone down by about a fifth over that period. And what's really happening here is that all sorts of different ways of acquiring customers and reaching consumers that aren't being captured in that spending anymore. Now, if I kind of generalize this and kind of go up to kind of the 60,000 foot view, for most of my career, people have looked at these kinds of technologies, looked at these kind of experiences and said, well, that's very interesting. But remember, most people don't have that. Most people don't have broadband. Most people don't have 3G. Most people don't have smartphones. Most people don't have an iPhone. Last year, over 80% of American teenagers have an iPhone. 90% of people in the UK are now online. Not literally everyone, but the default was always, well, most people won't do that. No, now the default is, remember, pretty much everybody will do that now. And I think the best way that you can express that is to look at this chart of how Americans met their partners. In 2017, 40% of new relationships in the USA started online. So this went from being something that was peripheral and kind of a joke to something that's an absolutely basic part of everybody's life. Anyone will do anything online if you can work out the right model or the right experience. Just to give you some illustrations of that, these are three companies that I looked at in my last job at Andreessen Horowitz. These are three companies that are building what we call two-sided marketplaces. So these are software platforms that connect people who are looking for a job with, or looking for employers with people who are looking for somebody to hire. And RigUp does that for oilfield work. Honor does that for home help for the elderly. Incredible does that for nursing. There's nothing terribly new about two-sided marketplaces. What is interesting about these is that these are fields and industries and demographics where you would not have said 5 or 10 years ago that you could take those people online. Those people are in trucks, they're in cars, they're in people's houses, they're not online. They don't have a PC or the PC isn't with them. Well, now they all have smartphones and they're all on Tinder or Grindr. Anyone is willing to do anything online. Oilfield workers, nurses, home help, those people are all willing to find to manage their life, to manage their job online. And so as my old boss, Mark Andreessen, liked to say, software ate the world. The problem is, or he said software is eating the world, well, software ate the world. The problem that we experienced in the last couple of years is that meant all the world's problems get expressed in software. In other words, we connected everybody, and that unfortunately included connecting all the bad people. And perhaps more importantly than that, it meant we connected all of our own bad instincts. And so that meant that at the beginning of this year, an important part of the conversation around technology was around regulation. And so there were all sorts of issues that suddenly went from being internal arguments inside tech, or things that had nothing to do with tech, to things in which policy and regulation around technology became sort of fundamentally important conversations. So in January, we were having three sorts of conversation. What happens when everyone is online? What are the next fundamental trends that come after that will reshape the tech industry? What comes after mobile? What comes after machine learning? What comes after smartphones? And then regulation and policy. How do we think about regulation? How do we think about government policy for all of these questions? I think in June, that conversation changed a bit, because now it's not when everyone is online, but what happens when everyone has to be online, because now we don't have a choice. And so then as we think about technology in June, we think about how technology intersects with that question of the new normal. And so there's now a very overused quote from Lenin that there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And we've had about 10 weeks in which decades seem to be happening. And I think there's sort of three, again, trying to break things apart, I would think about three fields to think about here. The first is that there is a very obvious acceleration. There is stuff that we all knew that everyone would have agreed was happening that's now happened much quicker. We've had a sort of a step change in the use of a whole bunch of behaviors. The second is there's a bunch of stuff that people would not necessarily have agreed, where we are all forced to try it, even if we didn't think we were going to use it in January. So there is a period of acceleration, and then there is a period of forced experiment. And then finally, as a consequence of those two, there is a market reset. There are all sorts of habits being broken, all sorts of behaviors being changed, companies being created, companies disappearing, markets being reset, and a whole bunch of people doing land grabs. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of these. First of all, I think very obviously we're all conscious that e-commerce has spiked upwards. We don't yet have official statistics for the US, but we do have numbers for the UK. In the UK, in April, e-commerce went from about 20% of addressable retail to about 30%. So addressable retail is retail excluding cars and gasoline and petrol and bars and restaurants. So it's kind of the stuff you can do online. And so in the UK, e-commerce went from 20% to 30% in a month. However, a lot of that is actually about the denominator. It's about physical retail shutting down rather more than it is about a growth in e-commerce. And if you look at the red line here, you can see, yes, e-commerce did come up, but what's really dramatic is that physical retail has shut down. Now, I think what's much more meaningful is if you look at particular verticals. So in the UK, online grocery sales doubled in April. And that wasn't about the denominator. That's actually a zero sum. That's about the shift from physical retail to online retail happening as online retail built the capacity to start delivering food on a kind of a mass scale across the UK. So we're seeing habits being broken and new habits being created. On the other hand, a lot of the pain from the lockdown is very unevenly distributed and often quite unfairly distributed. So in a normal recession, companies with weak balance sheets, companies in challenged industries, companies that are not fit for the future, that's where you tend to see most of the pain. In a lockdown, yes, those companies are in trouble, but companies that might have been very well run, have strong balance sheets, and be very well fitted for a digital future are also in deep trouble. And so in the US, bar and restaurant employment went down by 50% in just 1 month as a consequence of the lockdown. If you want to see a really scary chart, this is restaurant employment in New York, which went down by 85% in April. So there's a great deal of pain, but that pain is really super concentrated in some particular industries. And so anyone who's in that space is in much more difficulty than they might have been if they were in, say, financial services. Meanwhile, we have what you might call a green eggs and ham moment. So green eggs and ham is a reference to a Dr. Seuss children's book. You are forced to try it, see if you like it. And so we're seeing a kind of a green eggs and ham moment where you're forced to try it and see if it works across a whole bunch of spaces, very obviously in the current context in video calling. And so this data shows you anything from kind of 5 to 10 to 20% of people either trying video calls for work for the first time or using them much more than they had in the past. And we're seeing a whole bunch of kind of similar experiments at the moment around people trying to do some kind of remote thing that they'd never tried before. You see that again in the enterprise. They're coming from Silicon Valley. Talking about cloud and talking about SaaS is like a really old story. We were talking about this 10 years ago. It's become boring. It's not really interesting to say the future is SaaS. But in actual real big companies, most of the workflows are still and have actually not moved to the cloud. In fact, many of them are still on mainframes, and they're certainly still on-prem. So this chart shows you roughly 20% of workflows for US big companies have moved to the cloud. That's now changing very quickly. We have this great quote from Satya Nadella, unconsciously channeling Lenin, that Microsoft got 2 years worth of digital transformation in about 2 months. And I think we're seeing that across a whole bunch of other industries. Most obviously, indeed, across remote medicine and remote education, which were two of the most hidebound industries, the industries that were graveyards for innovation, graveyards for startups, the places where it was hardest to do anything new. And we're now seeing really rapid adoption, or at least rapid experimentation, and one should maybe make that distinction, of new remote technologies. In the UK, the NHS did a 48-hour tender for remote medicine. In the past, that would have been 48 days or 48 weeks, or cynic might say 48 years for them to adopt a new technology. Well, they did it in 48 hours. They chose 11 companies. Over 90% of general partners, that's what Americans would call primary care practitioners, have adopted a remote medicine solution of some kind. On the other hand, this is not happening everywhere. So VR should be having a moment now if VR was really going to be a thing, and yet actually interest in VR has not increased. Yes, the Oculus Quest is sold out, but you're not seeing an explosion in interest here. So here we have a spike in Christmas and a spike of product launch, but we don't actually have a spike as a consequence of lockdown. And it's not yet clear that VR is really going to is really ready to have its takeoff, or whether it's going back into another winter. So as we think about all of this stuff, there is the forced adoption of these tools, or the accelerated adoption of these tools. But it's actually more interesting to think about how that changes what we're doing. So with every new technology, you start by forcing the new tool to fit the old way of doing your job. You print your emails. And then over time, you realize you can change the way you do your job, or change what the job is because of the new technology. And so we've all started by doing everything by remote, everything by video, turning all of those coffees and stand-ups and meetings into video calls. Over time, I think we're going to start to think a little bit, slightly more sophisticated way about the purpose of those interactions, what we are really trying to do, whether putting 15 video tiles, each the size of each square, 15 square inch video tiles on a screen is actually the best way of building communication inside a company. What the real social dynamics are if you're not in an office, how you build social capital if you've never met anyone before. And so I think we've had a huge moment for Zoom. We're going to have another huge wave in the next 6 months and 12 months as people build a whole bunch of new kinds of interaction, new ways of thinking about social capital that are not just about pointing at a camera at somebody and talking. Meanwhile, again, we're having, as I said earlier, we're having kind of a reset moment. So everybody is now willing to try anything online. The digital incumbents are very often swamped. There are now 60 or 70 or more companies doing professional video conferencing of some kind. Zoom very obviously built a new business here, even though one would have thought that Microsoft and Facebook and Google should have had it sewn up. So there's a land grab, there's a rapid opportunity, there's a huge opportunity to create companies. Some of the physical incumbents sadly are going to disappear, and so that will create new pools of demand and new behavior. And so we're in this moment of destruction, but also in a moment of creation. To kind of get a sense of what that might look like, I thought it was kind of interesting to go back and look at this chart of US print advertising. So this, the bit to focus on here is the period from 2000 to 2010 in the middle of the chart. So the consumer internet comes along, and newspaper advertising and magazine advertising seems like it's fine. It's completely flat there's a spike for the dot-com bubble, and then it's completely flat all the way through to 2008. And then the financial crisis comes, ad budgets dry up, and the revenue goes down by a third, a quarter, a fifth, depending on what kind of company you are. And then the economy recovers, the budgets come back, but they don't come back to print. And so you've broken the habit. And so your revenue goes down in a sickening lurch in the moment of crisis, but then when things stabilize, your revenue doesn't stabilize. It doesn't come back. Instead, it carries on going down at a 45-degree angle. I used to call this the Wile E. Coyote moment. You've run off the cliff, but your feet are still going and you haven't started falling yet. And suddenly you pause and you freeze in midair and you look down at the bottom of the valley 500 feet before. And there's a brief moment where you realize what's about to happen and then you start falling. I think a lot of industries feel like they are in the period that newspapers were in here in the financial crisis, but they'll be fine afterwards, that the money will come back. Well, a lot of that money won't come back. A lot of habits are being broken right now. In particular, if we look at retail in the USA, the US retail industry is massively overstored, which is a lovely piece of jargon. There is massively more retail square foot per capita in the USA than there is in any other developed market. And part of that is about the kind of topography of American cities. But it's also a chart that looks unsustainable. And when something is unsustainable, generally it doesn't continue. So to pull some of those threads together, we're resetting the market. Anyone will try anything online, and some physical rivals will disappear if you can survive, if you can make your way through it, and if the habits that are being changed and broken are to your advantage and not to your detriment. So if we think about, therefore, where we might be in June and where we might be in December next year as we go from, you might say, before COVID to after distancing, the history of the tech industry in some ways has been a succession of S-curves. It's been a succession of kind of fundamental ecosystems that form the center of the tech industry. And each of those ecosystems, each of those S-curves lasted sort of 15 years. So mainframes were central to the tech industry for about 15 years, and they took computing to big companies. Then we had mainframes that took computing to every company. Then the web took computing to the global middle classes. And then the smartphone took computing to pretty much everybody on Earth. What's the next S-curve? What's the next fundamental generational change that reshapes the tech industry? Well, actually, it's that technology has now become a systemically important part of society. It's become part of everything that we do every day. It's really important to be conscious that that isn't literally everyone. The internet has now become the default. It is now in the UK, close to 90% of adults are now using the internet. Only, I think, 11 or 12% of UK adults don't use the internet. But again, that's not evenly distributed. So a third of people aged between 65 and 75 do not use the internet. Half of people over 75 in the UK still aren't using the internet. Particularly as we thought about social distancing and quarantine and home or delivery for groceries, that's suddenly become very relevant in the last 8 weeks or so. The same the same if you look at socioeconomic demographics. People in the lowest income groups and the lowest education and employment groups, 20% of those people are not online. So we kind of have to be conscious of the people who are left behind now and how we might reach those. But more generally, I think one should think about technology as another systemically important technology. And part of that means that development, part of that means it gets regulated. We regulated railways, we regulated industrial food, we regulated chips, aircraft, cars, databases. Now we will regulate software. And that agenda has gone quiet a little bit as we've been locked down. But as we come out of lockdown, that's going to become, I think, just as important, in fact, probably more important than it was in January. Something to think about as we all start founding companies is that regulation is a regressive tax. Having hundreds of compliance people or thousands of compliance people is a tax on companies. And so part of our conversation around regulation and policy and fake news and elections in the next few years is what that means for innovation and how we balance those two kind of competing and competition and how we balance those two imperatives. But meanwhile, if we take a step back to the last time that we went through some kind of economic social disruption of this kind, in the financial crash of 2008, 2009, there was a great deal of pain, but there were also a bunch of really important sort of systemically interesting companies created: WhatsApp, Uber, Airbnb, Slack, a bunch of other really interesting company creation happened. And we're almost certainly seeing the same kind of company creation now, particularly as every engineer on earth is locked up at home and sort of sitting, muttering, swearing, and cursing at the tools that they have to use, cursing at Google, cursing at Slack, cursing at Zoom, and thinking about what they could do that might be better. And so we're going to see a bunch of really interesting, important companies come out of that. I think what's changed, though, is that isn't just going to happen in Silicon Valley anymore. So this chart shows you global venture capital investing. Obvious point is there's much more company creation, much more investment happening now than there was back in 2008-9. But what's more important is the distribution of that. The company creation, software creation, venture capital, the creation of technology has become diffused. That it no longer all happens in the single global cluster around Silicon Valley, or most of it didn't used to happen there. Now we're seeing company creation happening absolutely everywhere. There's kind of an analogous comparison here with what happened in the Industrial Revolution, that the UK invented railways. And so there was a point in time when all the railways were created in Britain, but that didn't last. Over time, everybody else started creating railways as well. UK, France, Germany invented cars, particularly France actually invented cars. But that didn't last. Everybody else started making cars as well. And we're seeing the same thing now. We're kind of going through that same process of global diffusion as we look at software and as we look at the internet. In particular, I think it's worth thinking about many of the conversations we've been having around Silicon Valley in the last in the last few years as to how sustainable Silicon Valley's lead as a single global cluster will be. People have been saying Silicon Valley is over for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, probably since as long as there's been a Silicon Valley. But it's worth just drawing attention to a little piece of super local politics here, which is to look at Silicon Valley house prices. Silicon Valley house prices have effectively have doubled in the last 10 years, increased 80% more than prices even in New York. And so there's a point at which people in Silicon Valley start thinking, actually, it doesn't matter how driven you are. It doesn't matter how important that cluster is. We're going to start seeing a lot more diffusion of company creation outside of that single cluster. Now that everybody can diffuse outside that cluster, we're going to see a lot more, and we're probably going to see an acceleration of that. And then a final thing to think about, coming back to this point about the globalization of software, the internet was really an American invention. Computing was a European and American invention. But that's not the case anymore. Today, there are more smartphones in China than in the USA and Western Europe combined. A third of all the smartphones on Earth are in China and India. And so the creation of software, the use of software, the use of all of these technologies has gone from something that happened for a relatively small number of people in a relatively small number of places to something that will be an absolutely normal part of everybody's life everywhere on Earth. So with that, I will pause and say thank you.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.